$100? $100? $100? $100? $100? $100? $100? $100? $100? $100? $100? $100? $100? Yes. Throughout the 2020s, if you want to play a AAA game on day one of its release, you will be asked to pay 100 United States dollars for the privilege of doing so. Now, you may say, well, how does this happen? I mean, games at the start of the decade costed $60, $70. Now you're saying it's going to be $100? Yes, it will. Though, probably not via the way that you may necessarily expect. It feels these days like your money just doesn't get you very far anymore, as the prices for almost everything has gone through the roof. Food prices have skyrocketed, as has the price of clothes, and when it comes to household bills, it's really just tragic. I mean, Jesus Christ, what are we? Made of money? Oh, very funny. Unfortunately, however, when I look into my crystal ball, it's clear that video games are also going to follow this trajectory, though with a slight difference. Now, when people talk about rising video game prices, they're typically referring to inflation. I'm sure that the vast majority of people know what inflation is by now, considering everyone is constantly affected by it. But for the 5 people who don't, inflation is an increase in the general price of goods and services over a sustained period of time that results in a decrease in the amounts of goods and services that each unit of currency can buy as a result. AKA, your individual dollar, euro, pound, V-bucks, whatever, has less purchasing power as time goes by, which can typically be measured by the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, which tracks how much goods and services generally cost over an extended period of time. Now, you could say that there are roughly 3 levels of inflation, with the worst form being hyperinflation. This is where central banks bungle up their own economies by artificially oversaturating their own money supply, to the point where their currency essentially becomes worthless. Such as in the 1920s with the German mark, whereby it became so worthless that people started using it as wallpaper. Or in the 2000s with the Zimbabwe dollar, which became so inflated they had to print a $100 trillion note, which, for a time, was worth around a staggering 40 US cents. Or in the 2020s with the Argentine peso, whereby its value fell from being worth 5.7 pesos per $1 in September 2013 to 349 pesos per $1 in September 2023, an increase of 6,034%. Needless to say that hyperinflation wrecks economies so badly that people eventually lose all trust in currencies that undergo it. Which is, obviously, very, very bad indeed. Below hyperinflation, you then have high inflation. This is where currencies don't exactly become worthless, but definitely do become, well, worth less. Usually caused by temporary periods of economic uncertainty, such as during times of political instability, disease, war, or, in the case of the early 2020s, all of these at the same time. Hence why the prices for borderline everything went up during this period. And while not the end of the world, high inflation still causes significant economic struggle during the short term that, if not addressed correctly, can spiral out of control even further. And finally, below high inflation, you then have low inflation. And most economists will tell you that having a low amount of inflation is perhaps actually better than having no inflation, with many central banks in developed countries actually aiming to manipulate their economies to have a stable level of inflation of around 2% per year. With the idea being that if the value of people's money slowly decreases if just saved, then people are more likely to spend or invest it instead, which boosts economic activity and thus, assumedly, economic growth. Now, there is an argument to be made that this is also kind of a form of soft theft, as the idea that your currency and thus savings with it can slowly deprecate in value, despite you doing nothing at all to it, is somewhat bizarre, but nevertheless. While hyperinflation and high inflation are seen as undesirable due to the instability they cause, because a low level of inflation is seen as desirable due to incentivizing economic activity, we allow it to happen, resulting in a slow but steady decrease in the value of currency, and a slow but steady increase in the price of goods and services in tandem. One such good, or service depending on who you ask, of course, being video games. In the 1980s, the average AAA video game would cost around $40. In the 1990s, this would rise to around $50. Following suit in the 2000s to $60, where throughout the 2010s this would stay pretty much the same, until the 2020s, where the $70 price point would slowly become the new status quo. The 2010s is obviously the decade that stands out here, as on paper, it seems like the $70 price point should have occurred here, whereby now in the 2020s, we should be reaching the $80 mark. So, why didn't it? Well, it wasn't because game companies were feeling nice. There's two main reasons. First, microtransactions, as rather than having a high barrier to entry, games companies can instead lure people into their games via a lower price point, only to have them spend more at a later date. And second, quantitative purchases, meaning that while profits per sale can be less, due to the gaming industry soaring in popularity, and thus customers, profits can be regained by quantity of sales rather than quality of them. And these two reasons combined, like it or not, kept the average price of the AAA game down artificially. In the 2010s from rising to $70 to staying at $60, and in the 2020s from rising only to $70 rather than $80. However, there's a bit of a problem. As you'll remember earlier, that I said that the early 2020s was plagued with political instability, disease, and war, of which, when put together, resulted in a period of high inflation. And this means that whereas $60 in 2005, when adjusted for inflation, was worth an expected $80 in 2021, just 2 years later in 2023, this increased to a staggering $94.32, meaning that the 3-year period from 2021 to 2023 had around higher inflation than the entire decade before it. $94.32 in 2023 is $60 back in 2005. And if the average AAA game costed $60 back then following this logic, such games should cost $94.32 today, or, dare we round it up, $99. But before people get their pitchforks out, to state the obvious, of course, no one's gonna pay that. Psychologically, people were so used to the $60 price point for over a decade, so much so that the inevitable rise to $70 was considered almost offensive. So to even consider raising the price again so quickly, not to $80 or even $90, but to $100 bloody dollars, would be absolute economic suicide for any company who dared try and do it. Or would it? I mean, sure, game companies could just rely on their old reliables, upping their microtransactions and hoping they get more quantitative purchases. But what if there actually was a way to somehow convince people to buy such games at launch for their true inflated price? Introducing the double release. A double release is when game companies release their game twice at 2 separate dates at 2 separate price points. So let's say it's May. On the 1st, the game could be released once, and then a week later on the 5th, it could be released again for a second time. The core game is of course identical, but there is, however, one big difference: the price. Players who wanted to play the game on the 1st would be asked to pay $100 in order to do so, whereas those who want to buy it for the usual $70 would be forced to wait until the 5th, 1 week later, instead. A double release.
But that's not a double release. That's just early access.
If you say that, you're a moron. Of course, game companies wouldn't actually call it a double release, as that would look absolutely awful. And so instead, they'd brand it as if the game actually comes out only once on the 5th, and those who get to play it on the 1st are merely just receiving early access. But in this example, early access isn't really an accurate term to use, as in the gaming industry, this typically implies playing games that are still in beta, and thus, unfinished. Yet as in this case, the game has obviously already gone gold, then this early access is really just totally arbitrarily imposed. Nothing more than a way to hold the hype-driven customers hostage in order to make more money from their desperation. The double release. Now you might be thinking, well Alex, that's quite a devious little tactic there, but has it ever actually been used in reality? And the answer to that is, of course it has! In truth, the groundwork for double releases has been there for years. All the way back in 2011, EA implemented a similar tactic for 1 month early beta versions of their then flagship FPS, Battlefield 3, which proved to be a success. But it wouldn't be until the early 2020s would actual double releases for entire core games become commonplace, such as with Bethesda's flagship RPG, Starfield. If you visit the Wikipedia page for Starfield, it will tell you that this game came out on the 6th of September 2023. But this is a lie. As 1 week earlier on the 1st of September 2023, thousands of people were playing and live streaming the game all across the internet. But how? Well, because in reality, Starfield underwent a double release. Releasing on the 1st of September for $100 as part of the Premium Edition, and then again on the 6th of September for the base price of $70 as per the standard. Of course, as stated earlier, the publisher didn't actually brand it this way, instead choosing to call the first release mere Early Access, but nevertheless, this is a prime example of a double release in action.
Actually, the Starfield Premium Edition also contained DLC and in-game items as well, so...
Yes! DLC that wasn't even out at the time of release, and in-game items that no one really gives a damn about. No! As double releasing was a tactic that was still considered relatively bold at the time of its inception, of course game publishers had to bundle their first $100 releases with some bonus tat for the time being. But let's just pop the elephant in the room. The main reason people bought such a $100 release was, obviously, to play the game when it first came out.
Starfield Premium Digital Edition. You buying? I had not planned on buying it until I saw the 5 days early access. I'm leaning towards paying the extra $30. What about you folks? Absolutely. It releases normally on a workday for me, but with the premium it will come out at the end of the work week.
Already pre-ordered.
I don't care about the gear. I want the 5 days early access.
Already did, lol. Way worth it for the 5 days early access alone.
Early access, of course. I'm still getting the base game through Game Pass, but I didn't hesitate a second to pay for the premium upgrade, especially for early access.
I'm sad they did this, but absolutely I will buy. I would lose my mind waiting for 5 days knowing I could already play it.
The 5 days early access is worth the $30 extra alone, in my opinion. Double releasing has proven to be a phenomenal success. Starfield surpassed over 234,000 concurrent players in its first few hours on Steam. That's just the people who bought the premium edition with early access for $100. Let's do the maths. 234,000 times 100 is 23.4 million, and if we get 30% of that, that's around $6.9 million extra profit in just first release dividends alone. And remember, that's only the PC gamers, notoriously the hardest demographic to please. If even they're buying into this, just imagine how much the console gamers are. Oh god. Starfield Premium Upgrade has actually made the top 10 in the UK physical charts. It's at number 7. That's impressive for a code in a box that just unlocks the game a few days early for Game Pass subscribers. Nice little earner, this mini early access. I wonder if it'll catch on. Oh, it will. As, like it or not, the double release is an absolutely genius psychological manipulation tactic to get people to pay for AAA games for their real inflationary price. Because on the one hand, it's not egregious enough to seem like a big enough deal to complain about. As if publishers just flat out raised prices to $100 for all, people would simply reject it and perhaps even consider to start sailing the seven seas. But by making people wait just a little longer to pay the standard price they're used to, it ironically gives customers the illusion of control, and thus makes them more likely to consider the higher purchase, while at the same time silencing critics by making it seem like they're overreacting.
I really don't think this is that big of a deal. It's just...
But on the other hand, it is just egregious enough to make people want to buy it. Take big brand names like Grand Theft Auto, Fallout, or The Elder Scrolls. A mainline game in these franchises only comes out once every decade or so, if you're lucky. And so for fans of such franchises, the idea that these games could come out 1 week, 2 weeks, or even 1 month earlier, if they pay just a little bit more, would get many of them on their knees. Pads equipped. This is especially true when you consider how you could manipulate these first releases for maximum psychological torment. To use Starfield as an example again, did you know that on the 4th of September 2023, sandwiched between Starfield's first and second release, in the Western world's most prosperous market, the United States, there was a federal holiday, Labor Day, where people typically don't work or go to school? I'm sure that was just a coincidence and definitely not planned in advance, oh no. Imagine having waited for a game that you've been hyped for years, and thousands of people are playing it, all the reviews are out, and all the big streamers are streaming it. But meanwhile, you're just sat there, not playing it, all because you want to save $30. Most people would crack like an egg.
And as you can see, I have cracked the egg. It is a really solid crack.
Hence why the double release will soon become the standard across practically the entire AAA lineup. And if you want to play such games day one, you're henceforth going to require a fatter stack in that wallet. Now I have to be honest, the gamer in me weeps over this, as double releases essentially destroy the amazing atmosphere that midnight releases once had, where everyone got their newfound game at the same time, which really was something quite special, especially during the physical games era. But the investor in me goes, this is so genius. As look, people can get angry at game publishers for doing this, but at the end of the day, their job is to maximize profits for their investors, and if free money is on the table, they aren't just going to reject it. And people can get angry at gamers for buying it, but at the end of the day, people only buy things if they feel the monetary value is worth the experience. And if people are, then that clearly must be the case. As, let's face it, number one, $30 more in most developed countries is considered negligible for something you're very passionate about. And number two, as I've been saying for years, the gaming industry is now made up massively of goomers who rely on such virtual worlds, and as such are the perfect demographic to be financially exploited in such devious ways. It's crummy, funny, and some would say scummy, but at the end of the day, double releases are factually a mutually beneficial transaction, and are thus, like other wicked practices that came before it, sadly, likely here to stay. And you know, I suppose this should really get people to consider their stance on market regulation. A part of me wants to summon the idea of regulation to prevent double releases, similar to what should occur with microtransactions and loot boxes. But another part of me says such regulation would only lead to universal price hikes, which could unintentionally gatekeep more people out of playing the games they desire. Is entertainment such as gaming valued so little that such schemes are necessary in an inflationary environment in order to be profitable? Or is perhaps the reason people value such entertainment so little now is because of such schemes in the first place? This logistical spiral concludes in a different answer depending on who you ask, but one thing's for certain. The economics of gaming have become so unbearably complex, manipulative, and strange that looking back to the times when you simply bought a game and that was it, with no strings attached, seems like forever ago. Any regulation that spawns in regards to video games should stem to returning to such simplicity, while trying to minimize quantitative dismissal. Though that's certainly easier said than done. This truly is a great time to make money, but an absolutely terrible time to consume art.